Mr. Gray, as you pull up the next presentation,
Yeah.
let me just remind everyone, including those online, the next amount of money is the federal money that we kind of heard about earlier, called CARES money. It's not called that anymore, but we earn this based on our numbers of students, or our percentage of students that qualify for free or reduced lunch. Fayette County has a very low percentage of students compared to those in the state, so we earn probably some of the lowest. I think the lowest 3 districts. I think we're in the bottom 5% of all schools in terms of how much money that we earn. There is a lot of money out there for this, but unfortunately, Fayette didn't qualify for all that money. So why don't you give us a little context of CARES, and then give us an update on how much we have in each bucket.
Okay, and so the first slide that we'll show is just kind of a clarification on what we call CARES, and we say CARES 1, CARES 2, CARES 3. CARES was really only the first federal legislation that was passed back in 2020, the Coronavirus Aid, Relief, and Economic Security Act. There's a portion of it that's called ESSER. If I go back to the previous slide, it's called Elementary and Secondary School Emergency Relief Funds. So when we talk about the funds that are available for school systems, they've cut out portions of each of these laws that are called ESSER funds, and that's really more the correct terminology, but the federal, they are very good at all these acronyms. You can see the second law was the CRRSAA, and then the third one that was just recently passed is the American Rescue Plan, or the ARP. But those portions of them really refer to ESSER 1, 2, and 3, which is the funds for education. So also there are some additional grants in each one of those that provided for what they call equitable services, nursing, supplemental relief for IDEA, and some CTE grants. So ESSER 1, which was the CARES Act, was signed back in March, and we went through this before. $411 million originally came to the state of Georgia, and they had kind of 8 broad categories that we could use it in. Our usage focused in these 3 main areas: distance learning, facilities, equipment, and we did have, in that first round of funds, had to allocate some to private schools. So our budget was $1.167 million, and we've pretty much expended all of that. And I think with Mr. Sanders doing sanitation in the buildings this previous weekend, we probably have used all the CARES, all of this allocation. Yeah. And you can see the breakdown of where we spent that money. And a lot of this information we went over in previous meetings, so I won't spend a lot of time on it. You can see in distance learning, we spent like on Wi-Fi hotspots, Edgenuity, Georgia Virtual School, Zoom meetings, cleaning supplies, disinfectant packs, the personal equipment that was needed in facilities and equipment and PPE. And then we did have to make a couple of allocations to private schools. So that was ESSER 1. ESSER 2 came by in December of 2020. And the main categories were the same. Our allocation was $4.7 million, and I believe we did have a kind of a good long discussion of this at one of the board meetings about the budget for this. We budgeted $2.7 million for equipment, computer equipment, also a virtual elementary school administrator. We added some for supplemental budget, which goes to supplemental learning, which goes to summer school. And the core continuity of staff services. That was where we picked up the remaining portion of the governor's supplemental payment of $1,000 for teachers. We did have to pick up some of that, and so that was paid for out of our CARES funds, our ESSER funds. You can see we have some money allocated for nurses for some additional work, PPE again, and then some food service equipment to help with the serving lines. Okay, so that's on ESSER 2. And just on kind of some notes, we really probably don't need to go through the Educator One-Time Payment Award again, but I did give you some information there on the $1,000 and $490 for our retirees and $500 for the part-timers. And did think that we had, just wanted to show, let's see, trying to remember how many we had in total. So we had 2,964 employees that got that payment in total. So, all right, now on the ARP, which is the most recent legislation, and I think one of the things that's been confusing is recently, there was some, the state came out and said, hey, we got our plan approved, the schools are going to get more money, and people thought we were getting additional money versus what we were calling CARES 1 and 2 and 3, when really the CARES 3 is really ESSER 3, and so it was part of a plan that we'd already were aware of and funding. Our portion of that allocation is $10.6 million. But what the state required us to do to help them get their plan approved with the feds was to do an initial budget allocation of $6.9 million, 65% of it, and we had to submit that plan in July, which we did, and that plan was approved. Same basic categories that we've had before. 20% though must directly address learning loss. So our budget plan that we submitted to the state, that our curriculum department spent a lot of time, hard work on, really to focus in on that area. Yes, sir.
Give us a little definition of just how learning loss is defined.
Learning loss.
Well, that's going to be for things that particularly look at like summer school programs that are bringing students who might be behind up to the current status, or we're trying to advance them through to be more up to date.
So learning loss that might have occurred because of the juxtaposition of ways of teaching and all that sort of thing.
Well, right, yeah, because of the pandemic and us having to do students missing class, students, maybe because of virtual class, things of that nature that may have caused them to get behind, because they had to be out and quarantined or had to be out sick, those type of things to try to fill that gap. So, yeah. Okay, all right, thank you. Okay, so you can see what our submitted budget plan is for ESSER 3 funds. And so we're looking that the $6.9 million going to the different categories. And again, the continuity of core services, we allocated $4.5 million for teachers in the general fund budget as well, so that we can keep the current level of staffing. So,
Tom, can I ask a question on this?
yes.
So we have 2.5%, 2.49% allocated to mental health. It just seems, honestly, we didn't decide that at the board level. That came out of senior staff, or we think it's worthy of 2.5% of this money. Is that what the consensus is, or is this just money we throw out there? Now we got it. We do whatever we want with it.
Well, it's money that has to meet certain criteria categories that deal with these different areas. So it's not a percentage of. They don't give us a percentage. We look and say what is the most important thing that we feel, or the areas that we have need that maybe aren't covered elsewhere in our district. Where do we need that coverage? So that's why, and when you look at the mental health in that first round, we added staff directly dealing with those areas. So, does that answer what you're asking? Why is it only that percentage?
I don't think it was sufficient, but I appreciate the answer.
Okay.
But that's another day. I just wanted to understand why we did what we did.
But in your answer, it's pretty much for additional staff to deal with.
Yeah, our use of that category in this budget is for additional staff that deals with nursing services, counseling positions, and psychologists.
Yeah. So to continue on the questioning, sorry to put you on the spot on this, but the input that gave rise, I think, is what was being asked. The input that gave rise to the recognition of a need for addressing emotional issues. How does that work? Is that part of our standard procedures in the district to evaluate? If I'm understanding what the application is, we need counselors because there are emotional issues, right? Additional staff.
Yeah, I really can't speak to the
know.
Counseling question, to be honest with you. That is, when we went through our budget for the general fund budget and for this budget, those were big discussions on how we address those needs in the general fund budget and this budget. But as far as, particular, I really can't speak to counseling issues. To
Okay,
be honest with you,
and
'cause
so
I'm
that would
not
be,
trying to-
you would refer us to another department in
Yeah.
the system to.
Let's go back to the categories real
Okay.
quick. If you can show the categories, areas that were approved for us to spend money on. And I think part of the decision on these 8 categories is one, what are we good at doing? What do we have the capacity to implement? And what is it that we can measure so when you look at that top right-hand corner, it says mental and physical health,
Right.
counseling, telehealth, school nursing. We already do a lot in these areas. Some areas we do not get into. Some school systems have done a lot of different things in this area. We do have a counseling department that does a great job. We have added some resources there, not much in this area. We could do more in this area. However, there's some things that we don't have the capacity of doing because of our size, nor can we measure our effectiveness in these areas as well. And so, we did not get into everything, but we felt like adding a counselor, a half-time counselor, as well as adding a psychologist might be the best use of that fund. But we will have opportunities to go back and revisit this, as Mr. Gray mentioned, that we've only been allowed to budget basically 2/3 of this money, if my memory serves me. So we're going to have another opportunity to go back and budget the rest too. So we'll be looking at needs assessment at that point in time, and we may want to go back and address that area or one of these other 7 areas.
Does it, that's excellent, I'm glad you showed me that slide, thank you for that. Is it tie in then, at least in a loosely way, with the idea of social and emotional learning?
Well, I think that word social and emotional learning is sort of very broad, and I think to answer it, yes, but I wouldn't want to be, that word kind of means a lot of different things to different people. So, but clearly, this system has invested a lot in mental health in terms of we've had incidents of anxiety, depression, all of those areas, and we've got registered nurses in our buildings. We've done a lot in this area to try to stem this. There's a lot that we're being called to do as a school system. There's also some of those lines that we have to decide what should we get into, what can we sustain doing, and what should we not. I think the learning loss piece is probably the hardest but most important thing that we do. Let me give you an anecdotal piece this week. Friday morning, I'm at a school, and the staff, we tell ourselves this, but sometimes when reality hits us, we've got a lot of students that have not been in school for over a year, any school, because they've been virtual, or they've had circumstances where they couldn't log on, but they were still virtual. And so we've had a lot of, if you talk to any first grade teacher in certain schools, they're going to tell you how hard it was for them, because they had a lot of students come back that they'd never been in school before. And so this piece of students last year, some students didn't miss a beat, but we had a lot of students who had a very difficult time last year. And so this is their first full year back in over a year and a half, and it's been harder than we anticipated for many of those students, and really many of those teachers that have those students right now. That's why we have found to be in-person instruction to be the most effective, because what we've seen is a lot of the teachers are telling us this is really different this year with the students who've been out of school for a year and a half. They're learning how to do school, and so that quality of readiness for school has dropped this past year significantly, where we have students that really have to learn how to hold a pen, how to write their names, where we didn't see that as much in first grade in past years. That's a little bit more than what you asked, but it's kind of what we're good at, but what we're also struggling with too.
Sure. No, thank you for that.
Thank you, Dr. Patterson. Okay, so that is I think one more slide after that just kind of shows there's a little bit of money in some of these other grants that we're working through that they're very targeted, so they have to go to very specific things related to the ESSER funding. So, and more questions if there are any.
I have a question.
Yes.
Isn't there some sort of public participation requirement for the ESSER funds, and how are we handling that piece?
Yeah, I'm aware that there is. I know I've talked with our federal programs coordinator, and that is in the process of scheduling those. Having the board meetings count says some of that as well.
Okay.
The information that's given out in the board meetings.
Thank you, Mr. Pressburg, for that question. We should have put that in our presentation, but thank you. We'll look for opportunities to engage. We definitely want input and really our budget, our yearly budget as a school system, as well as any funds that we have. Through the Title I process, we've got really good ways of doing that, but this is, since this is sort of new to us, we could probably maybe communicate that a little bit differently than what we've done so far. So thank you.